Hello, we are live, and welcome to the Bradley J. Show. We're here with Rich Rubino once more. We seem to be doing this every week, and that's great. And we're going to
Yes.
talk today about Trump entering the race, about other former presidents who have tried to come back and how they fared, and how things will, how the divided Congress, how the divided lawmaking bodies will affect things. And also, I'm curious to find out how Rich feels that the delay in Georgia will affect the outcome, how the runoff election, who the runoff election will favor. And I do want to say that this is brought to you by Rick Walker's Rock and Roll Cowboy Clothes since 1932. New and vintage T-shirts, jewelry, leather jackets, including Vanson leather jackets. 306 Newbury Street, Back Bay, Boston. So, hi, Rich.
Hi,
I guess we'll
Bradley.
start with Trump enters the race.
Yep.
Certainly a different Trump and a different speech than we saw years ago. It seems pretty low energy, according to Jeb Bush, right?
Yeah, that was the nickname he had for Jeb Bush back when they were running against each other in 2016. So it's kind of ironic. Jeb Bush is kind of getting back at that, I guess. But yeah, it was a little bit more teleprompter oriented, but it did kind of have kind of the best hits, like, or the hits basically of Donald Trump. It was basically, for the most part, it was the same rhetoric, talking about retiring Nancy Pelosi, talking about the radical left. It was basically the same speech. I think just it was a little bit toned down in terms of kind of gesticulation, more or less.
Okay. And how does that affect things coming out early like that?
Yeah.
I, of course, I'm not even sure he would have run if he weren't worried about indictment, and I think he feels that's a shield against that.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
Go
there's
ahead.
some there's a little there's very little precedent for a candidate, for a major candidate, announcing this early. Remember, Peter Paul DuPont announced in 1986. He was a former governor of Delaware that he was going to run. Phil Crane, a congressman, that he was going to run in 1988. Phil Crane, a Republican congressman from Illinois, announced in 1978 before the midterm elections. But there's very little precedent. I know Jimmy Carter announced after the midterm. He spoke at the National Press Club, got very little attention. I think that Trump is basically sees that he sees. First of all, I do think he sees a scenario where he actually garners the nomination, and part of that, I think the best case scenario for him is that there's 6 or 7 or 8 other people that are running against him, and then he gets that 45-50%, kind of like he did last time, and wins the nomination. You've seen him already. He's gone after a couple of people. He's gone after Glenn Youngins, the governor of Virginia, who I think he sees as formidable, just elected last year in the off year in elections in Virginia, in part by running on a Trump message, but kind of a kinder, gentler Trump message without mentioning Trump. And Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, he just won by 19 points over Charlie Crist. Donald Trump is trying to do anything he possibly can to kind of halt that momentum. But I think that's basically the scenario those are the two that he probably fears the most right now. And I think that, one thing he would like to see is, 3 or 4 people running as kind of the never Trumpers. Maybe Larry Hogan, the former governor of
I was
Maryland.
gonna say, what about Hogan? And what
Yeah,
about Kasich? Would he ever come back?
I don't think so. I don't see. I mean, I don't. First of all, he hasn't really been in the news lately, but I don't see a scenario where he garners a lot of support. He ran last time; they ended up winning in Ohio. I don't think. I think he's kind of out of the political scene right now. He actually ran in 2000 briefly, and his slogan was Y2K, because I was right around the Y2K bug problem. So that was kind of a creative play on words or whatnot. But I don't think he's going to do it. I think Larry Hogan has been positioning himself for quite some time now to run. He's the outgoing governor of Maryland. He's been very moderate. He was very critical of his own party's nominee to succeed him as governor of Maryland, saying that he was kind of too far right. So he'd be running as somewhat of a moderate. He's actually the interest. This is a fascinating scenario. The 3 most popular governors in the country are Charlie Baker of Massachusetts, Republican; Phil Scott of Vermont, Republican; and Larry Hogan of Maryland, Republican. And those 3 states were the best states for Joe Biden in the last presidential election in 2020. And they all have Republican governors, all who essentially run on a formula of being a social moderate and a fiscal conservative. Essentially, they alienate themselves from the national party as much as they possibly can. They kind of run on their own records, and they're all 3 of them are extremely popular. They're kind of the last vestiges, if you will, of kind of the Rockefeller kind of moderate to liberal wing of the Republican Party, and electorally they're very successful. So Hogan will probably run. He's very much positioning himself. I think Adam Kinzinger, the outgoing congressman from Illinois, who was on the January 6th committee, is seriously positioning himself. Congresswoman Cheney is positioning herself. And Bill Hurd, a former congressman from Texas, is somebody who represented a border congressional district, is somebody who is very much anti-Trump or who's trying to represent that anti-Trump wing. So who are the others that might potentially run? Well, Ron DeSantis is obviously positioning himself. He could potentially use his victory in Florida the same way Thomas E. Dewey did in 1948 after winning 57% of the vote, or 56% when he ran for re-election in 1946, or the way George W. Bush did when he won 68.5% of the vote in 1998, then went in 2000 and campaigned all over the country saying, "This is how well I did this is how well I did in the state of Texas. I could do the same thing in the general election." I think that's what Ron DeSantis is saying. His basic message in a primary is going to be, look at Miami-Dade County. Hillary Clinton won it overwhelmingly. I became the first Republican to win it since the aforementioned Jeb Bush in 2002. I have appealed to Latinos. I have appealed to Hispanics. I have appealed across the board. And if you nominate me, I can essentially win the presidency. That could be his message, and he can use his victory over Charlie Crist as part of that message. Kristi Noem, the governor of South Dakota, just overwhelmingly reelected. Somebody who John Boehner, the former Speaker of the House, said that he thinks should run for the nomination. She's been a little bit critical of Donald Trump lately, which I think signifies, even though she was very much a supporter of Donald Trump, that she might get in the race. And then Asa Hutchinson, governor of Arkansas, who's really distanced himself from Donald Trump, has indicated that he might get in the race as well. Mike Pence, the former vice president, might have that scenario where a president and a former vice president kind of run against each other. And there's just a litany of other people that, whether Trump runs or not, or does not run, I think will probably at least consider entering the race.
You know, I don't think Pence has a chance because the right doesn't like him for obvious reasons, and the left doesn't like him for obvious reasons. He except for that one moment, was very much a Trump supporter. And Charlie Baker, sad thing about our system, you got a guy who's very popular. He couldn't get nominated on either side. He's stuck in the middle because he's too good.
I think first of all, in terms of Mike Pence, the one narrow lane he would have would be with evangelicals. That's the only edge that he would have, and he would have to really kind of run up the score with evangelicals. But Donald Trump is also very popular with evangelicals. Now, if Donald Trump were not in the race, then theoretically, I think he would be somebody who could really garner a lot of support with the evangelical community. But I agree, it's a very narrow lane in many respects for Mike Pence. And what Donald Trump will say, if you get this scenario where you have Donald Trump against Mike Pence, so Mike Pence was elected governor, then he was in 2012, then he was in a re-election race in 2016, and he was basically tied. So there's a possibility he could have lost the race as governor of Indiana. Then Donald Trump came down to Chris Christie, the governor of New Jersey, former House Speaker Newt Gingrich of Georgia, and Mike Pence, and Trump kind of reluctantly picked Mike Pence. And what Donald Trump will say is that if I didn't, this was his argument, he's going to say, if I didn't pick Mike Pence last time, he was going to be a failed former governor of Indiana who lost re-election. If in terms of Ron DeSantis, this is what he would say about him. He'd say Ron DeSantis was running for governor. Adam Putnam, the agriculture commissioner, was the overwhelming favorite, the preponderant front runner. I chose this guy because I thought this guy, because I didn't know Adam Putnam, so I chose this obscure congressman. He garnered the nomination. Then he wins the governorship with less than 1% of the vote. So I made this guy, and look how ungrateful he is. Now, in terms of Charlie Baker, obviously Charlie Baker's wing of the Republican Party is essentially dormant. The last kind of moderate to liberal Republican who really ran on that platform as of a New England Republican was probably going back to probably Lowell Weicker, who thought about running, governor of Connecticut, former senator from Connecticut, later became an independent governor. He was thinking about running, and Tom DeMore, his chief of staff, went to New Hampshire and trying to position him, was trying to say, what do you think of the Lowell Weicker running? And a member of the kind of muckety-muck of the Republican Party looks at him and he says, Tom, we have communists up here. And let me tell you something. Our communists don't even like your communists. So it's very rare that in this day and age that a governor from the Northeast runs for the Republican Party nomination. Now, it used to be a time, Nelson Rockefeller, he thought about running in 1960. Then he made a deal with Richard Nixon, where Richard Nixon essentially adopted part of his platform called the PAC of Fifth Avenue. 1964, he ran, and this is somebody running essentially as a liberal Republican, and he was the early front runner. But then when he got to the California primary, and California was winner take all at that time for the Republican Party, it came out about his divorce and the fact that his it came out that the fact that he had been divorced and he essentially left 5 children, and then he got remarried. This became a huge issue against him, and that got Barry Goldwater to win the nomination. Since then, there really hasn't been anybody kind of a serious that's run as kind of a moderate Republican. You've had some, for example, Arlen Specter tried it in 1996. He really did not get anywhere. He was kind of a social liberal. I guess Maury Taylor, a businessman, was a social liberal that tried to run as well in 1996. But there's really has not been an avenue for a moderate to liberal Republican to garner the Republican nomination.
Quick aside, why did Charlie Baker get out?
Oh, I think that he saw the handwriting on the wall. In his Republican primary, so Jeff Deal announced he was going to run for governor. Jeff Deal, a former state rep from Whitman, he had lost his reelection. He tried to run against Elizabeth Warren, lost by about 22 points. But Jeff Deal had the support of the conservative intelligentsia, the conservative wing of the Republican Party. And their basic argument is that the reason we've lost all these elections is for governor, for all these other offices, because our message hasn't gotten out. So Jeff Deal is going to go out, he's going to get the message out, and we're going to win. The problem with that scenario is there's really never been a Republican that can run as an unadulterated, unreconstructed conservative, the way that Jeff Deal has done, that's actually been elected statewide that I can think of. Joe Malone in 1990 running for treasurer is probably the closest. But even go back to Jaden Cox and Calvin Coolidge, they were essentially running as moderates. So Charlie Baker knew that if he runs in the Republican primary, he would probably lose to Jeff Deal simply because Republicans in Massachusetts, they do not like Charlie Baker. They do not like the moderate wing of the party. Jim Lyons took over the party. He has hegemony. He's the chairman of the party, and they want somebody who's more of a national Republican. And Jeff Deal obviously is more of a national Republican. Charlie Baker is a Republican that is very specific in kind of the Frank Sargent, Volpe, Cellucci, Bill Weld, at least Mitt Romney's first 2 years. That wing of the Republican Party, they did not want that. And Charlie Baker knew that he could potentially lose the primary. And then theoretically, he could decide, okay, why don't I run as an independent? He runs as an independent, then, that could actually help Jeff Deal and make Jeff Deal kind of a formidable candidate. So I think he saw the handwriting on the wall and he figured, why go through this?
Back to Trump. He has more of an uphill climb this time because of all the baggage.
Mm-hmm.
There's the January 6th hearings had to have some effect. Some people must have, let's just say it added some weight to his baggage. And things pop up. People know, like he didn't take security briefings. That kind, some say he just wasn't doing the job. He was too busy being angry and getting revenge and taking that time where he could have been doing the job. There's another bunch of baggage, and there are other things like that. How do you see that baggage affecting this attempt this time? And then we'll get into the historical attempts to come back.
Yeah, I don't think the GOP electorate necessarily cares about how much time, about security briefings or how much time he spent on the golf course, what he was working on. What they do care about is they want somebody who can actually win. And I think that they've seen Donald Trump and they've seen kind of his reaction to the past election, and they're looking at it and they're saying, elections are usually about the future. If 2024, if Donald Trump musters a nomination and he focuses on relitigating the past, then essentially he's giving an aperture for the Democrats the size of a Grand Canyon to say, Donald Trump wants to talk about the past. We want to talk about the future. Look what we've done in the past 2 years. Look what we're going to do in the next 2 years, particularly if the economy improves. They could say essentially the way that it did under Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama after the midterm elections. They see an avenue right there. And they also see Donald Trump as being divisive and somebody who has a ceiling of maybe 45% that cannot get over that. They see somebody who's never won the popular vote, and they see what happened in the last midterm election when Donald Trump type candidates in places like New Hampshire and Arizona lost seats that they probably had a legitimate chance of winning. And they're basically saying the Trump message is just simply not striking a resonant chord. That's why we have to nominate somebody else. I mean, it's kind of Machiavellian in a sense, but I don't think it's because of their opinions on
Okay,
Donald
good.
Trump, it's because they want to win.
And that's based on that they want to see someone who looks forward to the future instead of, as you say, all that time spent on relitigating the past.
And they know that if Donald Trump wins the nomination, they have friends and other people who are saying, well, who perhaps are sympathetic to the moderate conservative message. They're saying, but I just cannot stomach Donald Trump. So they're saying, okay. And we started this with the governor of Virginia last time around. Governor Youngins essentially ran as somebody very much a Trump message, but kind of made it kinder and gentler. And that's what they want. They want somebody who has a very similar message to Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump, he's transmogrified the Republican Party in the sense that his views on trade are different. He's an economic nationalist. That's now the main Republican platform, not kind of a globalist or a free trader, somebody who wants to restrict legal and illegal immigration, and somebody who's very incredulous toward foreign intervention. That's now the Republican Party platform. That's his legacy. He switched it from on all three of those issues, and now they see somebody that they, I think, want to kind of be his descendant in many respects of that message. And it'd be interesting if somebody tries to go back to essentially the Republican message going back from Eisenhower in 52 all the way to Mitt Romney in 2012. And that's going to be kind of an identity crisis for the Republican Party now. Does it go with Donald Trump and his ideology, or the status quo now, or does it go back to the status quo ante, which is essentially the status quo pre-Donald Trump? But Donald Trump, as long as he's still in this race, he's very much the status quo now of the Republican Party. It's interestingly, he was very anti-establishment. He's always been anti-establishment. Now, because he's a standard bearer of the Republican Party, he is now establishment.
Now let's take a historical look at attempts to come back and how they turned out. This is where you really shine. Well, you shine everywhere, but you're good at this, so let's do that. Go ahead.
Yep. Interestingly, a couple of them. So the first one to really try this was Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren gets elected in 1836. He was vice president under Andrew Jackson, gets elected in part on Jackson's coattails. There's a panic of 1837, a depression. Van Buren does virtually nothing. He was a Democrat at the party. The Democrats saw themselves as kind of guardians, a guardian presidency that basically said the president shouldn't do very much. He literally sold the White House tools, so they could not be used for public works projects. So it becomes very unpopular, loses re-election to William Henry Harrison. Harrison then dies. John Tyler succeeds him in 1841. And then John Tyler is very unpopular, does not win any party's nomination in 1844. And Martin Van Buren actually later tries to come back and run for president as a member of the Free Soil Party. The Free Soil Party, very much an anti-slavery party. Van Buren was actually more moderate on that issue, but he ends up winning about 10% of the vote. But he was he almost kind of became somewhat irrelevant. The next one was Millard Fillmore. The inimitable Millard Fillmore, everybody's favorite president, the guy who looks like Alec Baldwin. So Millard Fillmore comes in 1850, a Whig. He succeeds Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor dies. Fillmore does not win his own party's nomination in 1852. He goes around the world, comes back. In 1856, he literally was out of the country, and there was a convention of what was called the Know Nothing Party. They're really the American Party was their official name. The reason they called them Know Nothing is they're very much anti-immigrant. And when people would ask them, what did you talk about at your meeting? They would say, I know nothing. And they actually, in Massachusetts, they're more popular here than any place else. They controlled the governorship. Governor Gardner was in here. They controlled both United States Senate seats, the entire congressional delegation, and almost the entire state legislature at one point. They are extremely popular in Massachusetts more than anywhere else. Millard Fillmore does not seek their party's nomination, or probably didn't know much about them, but they wanted someone with a name. So they gave Millard Fillmore the nomination, and he reluctantly accepted it. He ran for president, wins 21%, wins one state. That's the state of Maryland. Then fast forward a little while to the one you're going to hear a lot about. Well, let's go first before that, Ulysses S. Grant. Grant gets elected in 1868, reelected in 1872. In 1874, when there was retroactive pay raises, the Republicans, his party, had supported. And there was a credit mobility scandal, very complicated. His party loses 94 seats, goes from a 71% majority to a 34% minority. Yet Grant seriously contemplates running for a third term, and this was constitutionally permissible at the time, in 1876. Decides not to. People said it would make him look like a Caesar. He goes around the world for like 2 years, becomes extremely popular again, General Grant. And then in 1880, he tells people, nominate me at the Republican National Convention. And they did. He was nominated at the convention. It was the deadlock convention. James Garfield, the congressman from Ohio, ends up winning on the 36th vote. The point is that he actually tried for a third term, and he had actually formidable support. Charles Guiteau, actually, the guy who shot Garfield, was very much Ulysses S. Grant's supporter. So he loses. Then we come to the one you're going to hear about a lot now, and that's Grover Cleveland. So Cleveland, who's the governor of New York, he gets elected president in 1884, barely gets elected, literally wins his own state by 1,047 votes. That's how close it was. And part of the reason he won, by the way, James G. Blaine, his Republican opponent, was listening to a speech by Samuel Burchard, a Presbyterian minister, rather. And in that speech, he called the Democratic Party the party of Romanism, and rebellion. He was talking about the Democratic Party, known as an Irish party. When he says the word rum, essentially he's implying that they are alcoholics, and then he says Romanism. That's implying that they are essentially Catholic because they support the Pope, going back to Rome. So that is basically gives Grover Cleveland a very small victory. He serves for one term, 1888, runs for re-election, and actually wins in the popular vote. Sound familiar? But loses in the Electoral College. The last day, by the way, when he was married, he was 46 years old. He was married in the White House to a 21-year-old. The 21-year-old, 23 at the time, actually, when Cleveland was leaving office, said to the White House staff, "Keep the place nice. We'll be back in 4 years." So Cleveland goes back, practices law for a little bit. Then he sees Harrison is extremely unpopular, does very poorly in the midterm elections in 1890, and Cleveland considers coming back in 1892. He decides he is going to run, puts his name in for the nomination. They didn't have primaries back in this time, so essentially it's all decided at the convention. And he had a couple of opponents. One of them was Horace Bees, a former governor of Indiana, but the other one was David Hill. And this is fascinating because David Hill, they're both part of the New York political machine. And when Grover Cleveland was governor of New York, David Hill was literally his lieutenant governor. Grover Cleveland moves up, becomes president. David Hill becomes governor of New York. Grover Cleveland in New York was always seen as somebody of a kind of a good government type, somebody who was known for trying to reform the system. David Hill, the exact opposite, was seen part of kind of the good old boy network, if you will. The main disagreement they had at that convention between Cleveland and his former protege Hill is that Cleveland was very much opposed to bimetallism, meaning that you would essentially allow more silver in the economy. He was a favor of the gold standard. Hill was not. Hill was a little bit more populist. So Grover Cleveland wins the nomination. Then he goes on the general election. He talks about how Benjamin Harrison had spent $1 billion, and he became the first $1 billion Congress, in part by giving a lot of very efficient in terms of giving money to former Civil War veterans. And Grover Cleveland lands up eking out a victory over Benjamin Harrison. The only time in history that somebody has lost. He's actually won the popular vote, you can argue, 3 times, 1884, 1888, and 1892. He comes back, and by all accounts, his second term is pretty much he is extremely unpopular. There's, just like with Martin Van Buren, there's a depression, Panic of 1893. Cleveland says, "I'm a guardian president, I'm not going to do much." There are protests. People protested the protest that was called the Executive Mansion, today called the White House. And in 1894, his party loses 113 seats in the House of Representatives. The all-time record has never been surpassed. And then in 1896, he's still unpopular. He doesn't even run for re-election. So fast forward all the way to Herbert Hoover. Well, I guess let's go to Theodore Roosevelt first. Theodore Roosevelt comes in. He was governor of New York, just like Grover Cleveland was, similarly. And he comes in part, William McKinley is looking for somebody as his running mate. Thomas Platt, the New York political bosses, do not like Theodore Roosevelt. So they say, how do we get him out of New York State? So he's not our governor anymore. So they say, all right, Mr. McKinley, the Republican Party, please choose him. We nominate him. We want him to be the vice presidential running mate. He's not going to do any harm. So he becomes vice presidential running mate. Actually, during that campaign in 1900, at one point, he gives about 18 speeches in a day. Then this former one-term governor becomes vice president. McKinley dies his first year in office. Theodore Roosevelt becomes president, succeeds him. And then the slogan is, they say in New York, now that darn cowboy is now president of the United States. 1904, though, after winning a landslide victory after Alton Parker's fellow New Yorker, the day after, Roosevelt said he would not seek another term after 1908, and he kept to that promise, but he always regretted it. So he served out the rest of his term, supported William Howard Taft over his own vice president, Charles Fairbanks, in 1908, by the way. Then in 1912, he saw William Howard Taft as being potentially too conservative, moving away from his policies. So he says, I'm going to run for the Republican nomination. And this time they actually had primaries. And he won the majority of the primaries. They went to the convention. William Howard Taft had the establishment sewn up. So William Howard Taft lands up mustering the Republican Party nomination. And Theodore Roosevelt says, I'm stripped to the buff. I'm going to throw my hat in the ring. And that's where that slogan, throw the hat in the ring, gets into the kind of general lexicon. He does run as a third party, the Progressive Party, the quote-unquote Bull Moose Party. And he actually beats William Howard Taft in that presidential race. He wins 27% of the vote. But Woodrow Wilson, of course, landed up winning the presidency, in part because there was this split, there was this fissure in the Republican Party. And there was one other example. Herbert Hoover, of all people. Hoover gets elected in 1928, promises a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. 1930, but he becomes extremely unpopular. Once again, just like Van Buren, just like Grover Cleveland, there's a recurring motif here, and that's that they all dealt with Great Depressions. Becomes very unpopular. 1932, runs for re-election, loses miserably, only really does well in New England, because that was the most conservative part of the country in many respects at the time. And in 1936, even though he was unpopular and been unceremoniously defeated in a landslide, he seriously contemplates running again at the Republican convention, and his name is put in the nomination. He does not win at all, but he was running basically as kind of a counterweight to what he viewed as the liberalism of Alf Landon, the governor of Kansas, who eventually became the Republican nominee. So he runs, doesn't get anywhere. And then in 1940, once again, he runs and basically says he makes the deficit, national debt, major issues, goes against the New Deal. And once again, Herbert Hoover loses. He only gets about 17 votes at the convention. So he was the last one that really kind of tried it as a Republican. He did it twice. So would you like me to repeat that?
No. So you mentioned Herbert Hoover and a chicken in every pot. It's remarkable how low expectations were at the time. That's all it took, a chicken in every pot.
1928, when he ran, that's what he said. Yep, when he was running for, because he came in after Calvin Coolidge, and he was Treasury Secretary. He was Commerce Secretary. But Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, under the Harding and Coolidge administration, was extremely popular because the country had been in extreme prosperity. Calvin Coolidge probably could have won re-election in 1928. Actually, Vice President Charles Fairbanks ran for the Republican nomination that year. He had a very, very bitter relationship with the President of the United States. So Calvin Coolidge told Republican delegates he'd view it as a personal insult if you nominate Charles Fairbanks as vice president. So they didn't. They nominated Hoover. Hoover basically just runs on peace and prosperity, and he absolutely, whipped the Al Smith, the governor of New York, who was his Democratic opponent. People were thinking these times are essentially we can buy stock on credit, we can buy stock on margin, we can do anything we want. The economy's going to roll. We're going to have peace and prosperity. And then Hoover gets in there, and essentially you have the Great Depression. Then he signs the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which increased tariffs on overseas products, and then there were retaliatory tariffs that those countries habitually put on the United States, and that landed up a lot of Americans started blaming Herbert Hoover. So you had Hoover bills, and they called it the Hoover Depression. Extremely unpopular, but he still thought he could win the nomination again in 1936 and then again in 1940.
Now, you mentioned the Whig Party. Can you talk about where that word comes from and a little bit more about the party? I don't know much about them other than I know they were a party that was against strong presidential power, too much presidential power, and they were against manifest destiny, and also folks like Daniel. I know Daniel Webster was a Whig type of person.
Yeah,
can you tell me more about the Whig Party?
It's very much a British party in many respects. There was a group in party in Britain called the Whigs, and basically they were what kind of would be an amalgamation of the Democrats and the Republicans today. Basically, they would nominate candidates that wanted somewhat more intervention in the economy, but not as much as, say, the Republicans when they eventually became, who wanted a lot more intervention in the economy. They're a party that generally supported opening markets overseas, but did in kind of a moderate way. The first one to be elected in that platform was William Henry Harrison. He ran in 1840, and in that election, he basically changed the way elections are designed permanently. They had a ball that would go from town to town, and they would write slogans about how great William Henry Harrison was, and this is where the slogan "Keep the Ball Rolling" came from.
Huh.
For example, believe it or not, that's where "Keep the Ball Rolling" came from, was that campaign. And then that campaign, they made these log cabin type jars. They look like log cabins. This guy named E.G. Booz, one of the benefactors of Harrison's campaign, made this, and they put liquor in them, and that's where the word booze came from. This all comes from this campaign. And Martin Van Buren, to try to keep up with the times, he would sign his legislation, he would sign personal correspondence okay, because his nickname was Old Kinderhook, because he was from Kinderhook, New York, and subsequently the word okay kind of caught on. That was and there were okay clubs, and that was very much for Martin Van Buren. He was succeeded by John Tyler. John Tyler was seen as somebody who wasn't really much of a Whig in the first place, and John Tyler could not get the Whigs nomination or the Democrats nomination in 1844. And then eventually you have Zachary Taylor and you have Millard Fillmore, and then the party started to dissipate after Millard Fillmore, and there was really kind of an aperture again in the political system for a party that was not the Democratic Party. Eventually you had other parties. The Free Soil Party came to try to become that second party, and then the Republican Party came and nominated John C. Fremont in 1856, who lost miserably in his home state of California. And then they came again in 1960 and nominated Abraham Lincoln. And they were a lot of those kind of wayward Whigs who wanted more government intervention in the economy. They eventually became part of the Republican Party, as did a lot of those Free Soilers kind of were absorbed into that party as well. And the Free Soil Party was the party Martin Van Buren was eventually in.
We have one question before we get to the divided Congress issue. If Trump doesn't get nominated, will he run as a third party candidate?
I think that's probably the worst nightmare for the Republican establishment right now. And yes, I do think it's possible. I think that was the worst fear they had last time, too, because they asked him in one of the debates, they asked every Republican candidate, they said, if you don't win the nomination, will you support your party's nominee? Everyone says, yes, I will, yes, I will, yes, I will. Donald Trump will not answer that question directly. If Donald Trump does not win, I do see a scenario where he essentially says, says, I have not left the Republican Party. The Republican Party has left me. The Republican Party has no guts, something to that effect. And I'm going to run as an independent the way Theodore Roosevelt did, in which case Donald Trump and the Republican nominee would split the same group of votes, which would certainly benefit the Democrats. I'm sure Joe Biden and the Democratic Party are hoping that that scenario is envisioned.
And if Trump is the nominee, do you see that as being a good thing for the Democrats?
Yes, because they've beaten him twice in the popular vote. He's somebody who's very much a divisive figure, and he's somebody who can never get over that 50% threshold in the popular vote. So essentially, the Democrats, what they have to do, they have to figure, where are we going to beat him? And based on the last election, I think they're probably going to decide that Florida is probably out of touch. They're probably not. Maybe they'll campaign a little bit in Florida, but they probably figure that Florida is becoming more reddening. I mean, Ron DeSantis may have had quite a victory there, but part of that was because they've gained about 500,000 more Republicans. It's just so much demography is destiny, and demography is electoral destiny, if you will. So they probably won't campaign that much in Florida. Ohio, they might be seeing it's kind of coming off the reservation. The same with Iowa. Then they can beat him in states like Arizona now, in Georgia. They probably think North Carolina, with the changing demographics and younger voters, they probably can beat him there as well. But Donald Trump does have kind of a base of white working class voters. But my guess is that they would rather run against him and basically say, this guy wants to talk about the past, we want to talk about the future, than another Republican that could define themselves. And that Republican who would have maybe have name recognition now, but very few people would know what their message is, would be able to define themselves. Whereas right now, the Democrats are very good at defining what Donald Trump is.
Right. And he lost the popular vote, and then he lost even before all the baggage. I know you don't think that the baggage is that important, but these elections are close, so it might make a difference.
Yeah, okay. It absolutely. It will make it. The people who this will make a difference for, I think, specifically, are kind of white collar suburbanites, for example, ones that have potentially voted Republican in the past, have potentially voted for Democrats on some other issues. For example, are kind of can go back and forth. In Georgia, for example, places like Marietta, Georgia, Newt Gingrich's old congressional district is now represented by Lucy McBath, a Democrat. because the Republican Party in Georgia is seen as kind of alien to kind of suburban Atlanta folks, for example. Or even the people in Georgia that voted for Brian Kemp, the governor, who went against Donald Trump in terms of saying the 2020 election was purloined in the state of Georgia, was stolen, and potentially would have voted for him, but also voted for Raphael Warnock, the Democrat. So those split ticket voters, those are the types that I think, and there are very few of those actually split ticket voters, maybe 10% of the population now, but those are the people who I think potentially would vote for a Republican if it was somebody other than Donald Trump.
And thank you for using the word purloined.
Oh, you're welcome.
You don't hear that every day. Okay, and we do want to talk about how past U.S. Congresses have acted.
Yep.
And how things turned out there when they're as divided as this one is. Oh, and by the way, even though Republicans take the House, if it's by a slim margin, talk about how important the margin is.
Yeah,
like it being only, say, 10 seats or 8 seats. That makes things a lot more difficult for someone, say, like a Kevin McCarthy.
Oh, it's extremely difficult because in Kevin McCarthy's case, his biggest headache may not necessarily be the Democrats, but it may be the Freedom Caucus on the right, including the 30 members that voted for Adam Briggs, for his opponent, who ran against him for the Republican congressman from Arizona, who ran against him for the nomination, essentially for the speakership last time around. The Freedom Caucus is going to do everything they possibly can to essentially increase their influence. And part of that, one thing they could say is, we're not necessarily going to support you. We're not going to support you unless you give us more influence, unless you let us serve on more on better committees, unless you let us be part of the steering committee that appoints members of where they're going to go in terms of the conference, where they're going to go in terms of what committee they're going to be on. So that's part of his headache. And his other headache is going to be simply that it's going to be very hard for him to get any legislation passed. He's going to have to get a unanimous support, virtually unanimous with his party, maybe siphon off a few Democrats. He tried, I guess Republicans tried unsuccessfully to get a very conservative Democrat, Henry Cuellar from Texas, to go over to the Republican Party. He turned down their overtures, but it's just going to be very hard. And the other thing that's going to be very hard is, in order for him to get legislation passed that gets to the president's desk, first of all, it has to go through his House. Then it's going to have to go through the United States Senate, and the United States Senate will be controlled by either one vote or will be tied with Vice President Harris breaking the tie in the United States Senate. So how much legislation can actually get through? Now, he can be an obstructionist in many respects. If Joe Biden's, has a Democrat send up legislation, he can very much say, this isn't going to come to the floor. This isn't going to the hopper. We can essentially make that this is going to stay in the hopper, rather, or this won't go to committee. We won't put this to the floor. We're up to the floor. But other than the fact, if he wants to really work with Chuck Schumer and work with Joe Biden on getting pieces of legislation done the way Bill Clinton did in 1995, getting welfare reform, healthcare portability, minimum wage increase. Well, didn't get that with both of them, but he got welfare reform because he worked with Trent Lott, Bob Dole in the Republican Party, and then Newt Gingrich on the in the House of Representatives and the United States Senate, respectively. So if there's legislation, maybe something to do with trade, which I don't think is going to happen, then get that done. Then get very minor pieces of legislation done. But it really is a headache. Generally speaking, in a political party, you want to have as big a majority as you possibly can, because that just gives you leeway. And he's going to, as much as if he alienates himself with the Freedom Caucus, then maybe he's going to get some support from those moderates. But on the other side, if he alienates himself with some of those moderates, then he's got the issue of the Freedom Caucus on the right. So it's really a no-win situation for Kevin McCarthy.
All right. So back to, in the larger sense, how divided Congresses fare historically.
Yes. It's actually been more divided, believe it or not. The fascinating election was 1916. Woodrow Wilson is running for re-election. He barely wins. Charles Evan Hughes, his opponent. The story is that Charles Evan Hughes goes to bed thinking he's going to win. A reporter asks for a comment from his aide, who was standing in front of his door, and he said essentially, the aide said, "Well, the president-elect is asleep right now," and the aide said, "Well, when he wakes up, we tell him he's no longer the president-elect." So it was very close, but in the midterm elections, the 1960 congressional elections, the Republicans literally picked up a one-seat majority, 216 to 215 over the Democrats. So what did the Democrats do? This is something you see in Israel, you see in Great Britain, you see in other countries that have coalition governments. They formed a coalition government because there were 8 progressive members and 1 socialist member. They said essentially, will you come into the Democratic full caucus with us? We'll help you. We'll get you on the committees you want. In return, we want to essentially rule the United States House of Representatives. They did that. So by 1917, the Democrats had a majority. These folks caucused with them. Now, did anything get passed during that time period? Well, the major thing that Woodrow Wilson is known for is World War I, even though he campaigned saying he kept us out of the war in 1916. In 1918, there was a formal declaration of war. They actually had a Congress. The Constitution actually specifically states that Congress shall declare war. Now, essentially, you just authorize it. But Congress passed that overwhelmingly, bipartisan support. And not very proper on college campuses, but the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution was passed in both the House and the Senate. And it got, the 2/3 majorities. And that, of course, outlawed the sale of alcohol. So those are the two things that were passed major in that during that Congress. The other one that's fascinating is Herbert Hoover in 1930. His Republican Party lost 52 seats in the House of Representatives that year, but they still had about a 1-seat majority. Then all of a sudden, and this is fascinating, between the time of the election and the inauguration of the new Congress, 14 congressmen-elect, including died, and the Speaker of the House, Nicholas Longworth, all died, giving the Democrats a majority. Fascinating. 14 members died. I know today, I don't know what QAnon would say about it, but 14 members all of a sudden died, and that gave the Democrats the majority. So absolutely fascinating. But Herbert Hoover basically got very little legislation done. Congress would try to pass. The Democratic Congress would pass legislation. And for the most part, Herbert Hoover would veto most of that legislation. So those are probably the two examples of when this Congress was that divided. I guess the other one would probably be when George W. Bush came in 2000, very much divided. Remember that 36 days in Florida, a protracted process, but in Congress was also very much divided. And Denny Hastert, the Speaker of the House, had a very tenuous majority. But then after September 11th, there was very much a rally around the flag effect. And as a result, Dick Gephardt on the Democratic side, Denny Hastert on the Republican side worked on getting the Patriot Act through. They worked on getting the authorization for use of force in Afghanistan, only one dissenting vote, Barbara Lee from California, and the use of force in Iraq as well. But that was partly not because of what happened in 2000. It was simply because of the events of September 11th. Those hijackings basically afforded an opportunity when basically just about anything could get passed. And I think some people later on kind of regretted having voted for the Iraq War and having voted for the Patriot Act at a time when there was just kind of unison in the country in terms of, and the political process, and politicians were generally not as despised as potentially they are today.
That's all great stuff. Can we get back to the election?
Yes.
Coming up? Okay. I mean, I don't mean to minimize that, but I'm just going to it quickly because I want to get it in.
I get it.
What chance does Trump have if Rupert Murdoch is hating on him? Really, there was the headline, the sort of lower banner in was it the New York Post that just said "Florida man makes announcement." That was the extent of it. That's really what they said. Florida man makes announcement at the bottom. They didn't even use his name, and I've seen Fox anchors dissing on Trump. What chance does he have?
I think, first of all, he can actually use that to his advantage because he can now say that Fox is part of the mainstream media. He can call it the liberal Fox News. He can say that you want to really get information, go to One America, go to other sources that are more sympathetic to him. He basically will say that Fox News is part of as a corporate sellout. So I think it actually can work to his advantage in many respects. But obviously,
he can say that, but Fox News is the mainstream source that got him elected last time.
Partly, but he also, when he talks about the media, and there are people, and you hear this from many Trump supporters, they essentially are very much, they have they're antithetical to what they see on Fox News because they say that Fox News is better than the other networks, but it's still part of the corporate establishment. And this is part where where right meets left. The right wing of the Republican Party, just like the left wing of the Democratic Party, are very much anti-corporate right now. So they're essentially can go after Fox News. They're just part of this corporate. They're just essentially being paid to say this, and that's basically what the message is. So I don't think Trump has to necessarily worry about Fox News. I think he can actually use that to his advantage. And he runs very much as a populist. They can say that Fox News is part of the country club Republicans. That's what you know that before I came in and I changed the whole trajectory of this. So he can use that to his advantage. But I mean, the biggest problem Trump probably has right now, it certainly is this after these midterm elections, there are so many conservatives, so many Republicans who are sympathetic to his policies, may have even liked him in the first 2 years, who are saying his message is essentially could resonate with somebody else, but we have this guy giving the message, and then
Right.
you're relitigating the past. That's the problem Donald Trump essentially is going
Yeah.
to have. And someone like Ron DeSantis, and we're saying Ron DeSantis now, but I'm sure there's going to be somebody else that's going to take over and be the front runner. There's always is.
Right.
It's not just going to be Trump versus DeSantis, but DeSantis is going to come in. He's going to say, "Look how well I did. I won Miami-Dade County running for re-election as governor of Florida. I'm a unifier. I'm somebody that can win in the general election." And then Donald Trump's going to look at him and it's going to say something to the effect of, you're a sellout, you're an average governor, Ron Santimonious, you're a liberal. I made you. The only reason you got the nomination is because I supported you over Adam Putnam. But I don't think that Fox News is necessarily going to be his biggest obstacle.
I can see the point you're making. That they would say, there are people with the same message. Why not get a fresh horse?
But he would say, what he's going to say too is he's going to say, look what I've accomplished. He's going to say, look where we were at that time. Look where we are now. Look where we were in terms of inflation then. Look where gas prices were then. I mean, I'm not talking about the morality. I'm just talking about the pure Machiavellian politics of it. He's going to say, this is where we were under my presidency. Then he's going to say, what is Ron DeSantis or what is Christine Noem? These are just politicians at a very low level. Or they can say, these are career politicians. I'm the first businessman that got elected. You need my kind of business acumen. You need my business dexterity. I've already been there. I've already been president. And that's basically what he's going to say. And I'm sure he'll give a nickname for just about every Republican candidate that tries to run against him.
One thing I have to say about Trump is the fact that he can keep going in the face of all these things piling on top of him. This lawsuit, Mar-a-Lago documents, January 6th. He just keeps on plugging. It's kind of I wouldn't have the wherewithal to keep. I would just say, forget it. If I were him, I would just go, sit on a beach and drink drinks with umbrellas in them, and that would be it. I'd say I was president. I did enough.
Well, I think he's got the same kind of hypomanic personality that Bill Clinton had. During the Monica Lewinsky scandal, for example, Bill Clinton basically maintained his presidency the same way he had prior to it. He gave that State of the Union address, remember, just 1 week after the Monica Lewinsky scandal broke, and people saying, "Will he announce he's going to resign? Will he talk about Monica Lewinsky in his speech?" And he gave what was a pretty good speech. His job approval went up to about 78% at one time. He went all around the country, the next couple of days, campaigned. He went to Africa. He went to China that year. This is all while everything. He ordered Operation Firefox, for example, in Iraq. The next year, then you have Kosovo, for example. So he was basically able to compartmentalize. And I think Donald Trump and Bill Clinton are similar in that. No matter what else is going on with them, they're able to compartmentalize and kind of keep the eye on the prize in many respects.
All right. Atlanta runoff. So there's
There's
an overtime period, and in football, I think overtime periods tend to benefit one side or the other, and probably even more so in this. And I'm curious to know whom you think the overtime period will benefit. I figure it'll benefit the Dem just because since the election, there's this perception the momentum for the Republicans is gone, and the perceived momentum matters when people vote. That's kind of why during this election the right was smart and kind of fudged the way the polls were going and made it seem the polls were going more their way than they really were. Mm-hmm. It's a way to build energy. Well, that sort of thing might be working against them now in this runoff.
I concur with that. I think this definitely benefits Raphael Warnock and the Democrats. If Nevada had gone the other way and Nevada had gone to the Republicans, then I think essentially, and this all came down to the state of Georgia, then every single Republican would be coming out to vote for Herschel Walker because they wanted the United States Senate to be under hegemony of the Republican Party. Now, essentially, the argument for the Republican Party is, okay, let's get Herschel Walker elected, then we're just one seat away from essentially majority, because I think it generally depresses turnout in that respect. On the Democratic side, obviously just some momentum. A lot of Democrats thought they were going to lose a couple seats in the United States Senate. Now they can say essentially, let's give us a little bit of breathing room. Let's give us one more vote. You've seen a little bit. So Georgia's the only state that has, one that has a runoff for a United States Senate election, meaning if no one gets 50%, they have a runoff. So in this case, Chase Oliver was libertarian. He won about 1.9%. So as a result, you're going to have another election. Now, has this happened before? Well, 1992, Winch Fowler was running, and he against Paul Coverdell, and they actually had an election about a month later. Bill Clinton went and campaigned for Fowler, but Coverdell, of course, landed up winning. But at the time, Republicans, I think there was probably a little bit of momentum for the Republicans because they had lost miserably in the House and the Senate. They lost, they were down by about 10 seats in the United States Senate. They're saying we have to do something to send Bill Clinton a message, and it probably benefited Paul Coverdell. But this time around, my guess is, to the extent it matters at all in terms of whether people come out to vote, there's probably going to be more people that are going to be coming out and voting for Raphael Warnock than they're going to be coming out and voting for Herschel Walker. There's probably a little bit more disconsolate or depression on the side of some conservatives, but obviously Donald Trump will probably be out there campaigning towards electoral benefit. Mike Pence and just about every solitary Republican who's trying to make a name for themselves will do everything they can to try to put Herschel Walker over the edge. And if he does win, then the next day the story is going to be, well, this is kind of our consolation prize. At least at the end of the day, we knocked off an incumbent United States senator in a swing state.
One final observation, and you can comment on it. It used to be that character kind of mattered in terms of if you were seen as cheating on your wife, that was a deal breaker. No more. If you were seen as being a liar and a hypocrite, that mattered. No more. And given the allegations against Herschel Walker regarding paying for an abortion and all, regardless of the trueness of that, that doesn't even matter at all, not even a thing. Just doesn't show up on the radar.
Yeah.
Why did that happen? When did that happen?
Well, go back to 1956, 1952, 56. Adlai Stevenson, the former governor of Illinois, was the Democratic nominee for president. And one of the issues that really hurt him that year was the fact that he'd been divorced. There was a Happy Days episode, as a matter of fact, where Richie Cunningham was supporting Adlai Stevenson, and his father, Howie Cunningham, as well as the Fonz, were supporting Eisenhower. And Howie Cunningham looks at Richie and he says, if he can't keep together his own family, how do you know he's going to keep the country together? And this was a serious message at that time. Imagine today if a candidate was divorced and that was essentially what isolated them. So Nelson Rockefeller runs for president in 1964. He'd been divorced, and that was probably the reason why Barry Goldwater won California and won the nomination, because a lot of people in the Republican Party were sick and tired of this kind of immorality of Nelson Rockefeller being divorced. Now Ronald Reagan comes along, and he'd been divorced, and he won the presidency in 1980 and reelected in 1984. And ever since then, we've had John Kerry, we've had John McCain, we've had Donald Trump, Rudy Giuliani, Newt Gingrich. All were divorced, sometimes multiple times, and it was a de minimis issue at best. So I think what has to happen is kind of you break a precedent, and then nobody cares about that anymore. Now, if somebody's married 2 or 3 times, nobody cares. And I think we're at a time also where ideology trumps just about everything else. In terms of Herschel Walker, you could put anybody up in terms of Herschel Walker, Raphael Warnock. People want to see what your message is. We saw this in Pennsylvania when John Fetterman became the Democratic nominee in Pennsylvania. He wasn't the favorite of the Democratic establishment in the primary. Some people probably thought Colonel Lamb would be better. He wins the nomination, and all people wanted to say, even after the debate, was we want somebody who will represent our message. On the Republican side, many Republican establishmentarians were saying, Dr. Oz, he was never part of Pennsylvania. He was from New Jersey. He was never part of did he ever give money to the Republican establishment? Did he ever, participate? But then he wins the nomination. People say, well, this guy is going to be the person that's going to spread our message. We have to support them. So we're at this time now where personality, morals are very much secondary or tertiary, I think.
Now it's just, this person is going to do what I want.
Yes.
And we don't care whether he is a murderer. We don't care what he's done, what laws he's broken, how much he's lied, whom he's hurt. All we care is he's going to go there and get done things that will benefit me.
But that's well, I don't know if it's even benefiting me. I think what I'm talking about is ideologues, and ideologues. It's not necessarily who's going to benefit me or who's going to benefit or who's going to benefit from it from legislation or ideology. So much of it is, I think, we're on this kind of Red Sox Yankees scenario where everything is about wanting to be on a winning team, and we want our team to win, so then you can essentially be part of an affinity group. An affinity
Yeah,
group is so much of it on both sides of the aisle. You have certainly, you have the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party. That's very much an affinity group. Donald Trump's wing in the Republican Party is very much an affinity group. And I use those two because they're both seen as people who kind of have a certain ideology.
yep.
But I think that for a lot of their supporters, it's not really even about them. It's more about just being part of a group that agrees with them ideologically. That you can go to people and say, "Yes, we're on this team. We're on this message. You're on my side." And I mean, it's all politics has always been like that. But there are others. Now, the people you're talking about, what's about me, how it benefits me personally,
Yeah.
those are probably people. For example, someone that lives on Wall Street that's saying, well, how's this tax plan going to benefit me, going to benefit my company? So I'm just going to vote for this candidate. It's about the deficit. Do I want interest rates to go out? And they're thinking about their personal economic situation. Those people are probably not necessarily voting based on party. They're voting just based on who can do the most for them.
Yeah.
I think and lobbyists give to everybody.
Okay, but Donald Trump's not exactly ideologically pure, historically speaking. He knows what this group of people wants. He decided, okay, I can become president by appealing to these people. He does it. He knows what they want for them, and I hold him up as an example of proof that my point is right. That it's about what you can do for me, because he's not ideologically pure at all.
He's ideologically pure in the fact that he's changed what it means to be ideologically pure.
Oh, okay.
Now it's seen as being conservative. To be,
if you're conservative today, that's enough.
When Ron Paul ran for president in 2008, he was up on the stage, and Rudy Giuliani was up there. And Ron Paul, they asked him a question about Iraq in September 11th, and Ron Paul says essentially, the reason they attacked us is because we're over there. He basically talked about the reasons that Osama bin Laden had his declaration of war, and part of that was because of economic sanctions on Iraq and because the fact that United States troops were in Saudi Arabia, which Osama bin Laden viewed them as apostates and did not want the idea of there being non-Muslim soldiers on the land of Mecca and Medina. So that was essentially Ron Paul brought that point up, and Rudy Giuliani looks at him and he says, you really need to apologize for that. That's just like something some of these left-wing professors or people in Saudi Arabia said. And he gets a great big applause for it, okay? Ron Paul, the next day, there are people in the Michigan Republican Party said, don't let Ron Paul in any of the debates anymore, okay? So that was Ron Paul's message. It was different than everybody else in the Republican Party at that debate. Next day, everyone's talking about what Ron Paul said. Donald Trump runs in 2016, and he's talking about with Jeb Bush, and he says basically your brother was responsible for the war in Iraq, huge disaster, killed 1 million people. Now, Ron Paul's message and Pat Buchanan's message too, in many respects, of being non-interventionist is now mainstream within the Republican Party. And if somebody says, for example, when it comes to Ukraine, and they say we should stop funding the Ukraine, this money needs to be spent here. We need to be protecting our own borders. We need to be stop spending on Ukraine. That is now considered the conservative message. So it changes over time. It's not finite. And the same thing with trade. If somebody like Donald Trump had made his message on trade the way Pat Buchanan did, very similar in 1992, most Republicans and establishment conservatives would say Pat Buchanan's basically just giving the same message as Ralph Nader or Jesse Jackson or any other liberal. And this isn't really a conservative message. Now that's the conservative message. It all changes.
All right. Very well put. Thank you very much. Which is just about an hour exactly, which is a long, long time. And the time did fly by. Thank you very much. Take the last 60 seconds to tell them about your books and how you can be contacted to speak, because I know you do speaking engagements now, which is cool.
Yes, absolutely. I'd love to do it. My last book is The Great American Political Trivia Challenge. Political trivia on steroids. It'd be a great holiday gift. Just Google Rich Rubino, Rubino, perhaps Google on Amazon. You can get it that way, or you can find me on Facebook and friend me there, Rich Rubino, Rubino. and you can see all my interviews that I do there. Or you can go to Rich Rubino MHD over on Twitter, or over on Instagram. And then on Twitter, just go Rich Rubino POL. But either way, you can certainly find me, and the book is currently $20. And if anyone needs a speaker about the political process and how unified we are, feel free to contact me.
I have the political trivia book. It's fantastic. It would be a great gift. Thank you very much, Rich
Thank you so much
Rubino.
for thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely. We'll talk to you again soon. Bye, everybody.
Will do.
We'll be out of here in 5 seconds.